It started on a Monday morning, the kind that already feels heavy and gray before you've even had your first coffee. I walked into the office and my heart just dropped. Ella's desk was empty, not just she's on vacation empty, it was sterile, wiped clean. The stubborn little succulent she'd nursed back to health was gone. The crayon drawing from her niece, the one that looked like a psychedelic potato, was gone. And the photo, the stupid, goofy photo of us after we landed the Kensington account, grinning like idiots with cheap champagne, that was gone too. The space she occupied was now just a generic corporate void. Monitor, keyboard, mouse, nothing else. A cold, formal email from HR landed in my inbox a few minutes later, its corporate jargon a flimsy shield for the brutal news. Ella had accepted an opportunity at our Manchester branch, effective immediately. No farewell party, no group email with a cringy subject line like "so long, farewell," she had just vanished. I sank into my chair, the cheap fabric groaning under my weight. I stared at that empty desk, at the ghost of a friendship, and a wave of thick, suffocating regret washed over me. It wasn't confusion, it wasn't even just sadness. It was a nauseating, dizzying certainty. I knew with a clarity that felt like a physical blow to the gut that this was my fault. Every last bit of it, I had done this. I had erased her from my life and from this office as cleanly as if I'd taken a cloth and wiped her desk myself. And the worst part, I couldn't even remember the exact moment I decided to do it. It all just happened. To understand how I could do something so monumentally stupid, you have to understand what it was like when I first started at Sterling Cross a year ago. I was a fish out of water, gasping for air. It's one of those trendy, open-plan ad agencies where everyone seems to have been born with an innate sense of cool. They all wore the right clothes, knew the right people, and talked about obscure art installations in Berlin like they were discussing the weather. I, on the other hand, felt like I had imposter stamped on my forehead in invisible ink. That's where Ella came in. She was an account manager, quiet but fiercely competent. She wasn't one of the loud, backslapping types who dominated every meeting. She was the opposite. She was the one you'd find in the corner, headphones on, meticulously color-coding a spreadsheet that would end up saving a multi-million-dollar campaign. She saw me struggling, saw the panic in my eyes during my first few weeks, and she threw me a lifeline. It wasn't with grand gestures. Her loyalty was a thing of quiet, consistent action. I remember my first major client presentation. I completely bombed it. I mixed up the demographic data, my slides were a mess, and I could feel our creative director, Damien, physically cringing. I went back to my desk wanting the floor to swallow me whole. That night, Ella stayed late with me. She didn't say "I told you so" or offer platitudes. She just sat down, opened her laptop, and said, "Okay, let's fix this." We were there until 1 a.m., rebuilding the entire deck. We, as in she, did most of the heavy lifting, turning my disaster into something sleek and persuasive. Another time, in a team-wide meeting, Damien was on the warpath, and for some reason, he'd set his sights on me, questioning my projections for a new campaign. I was floundering, my mind a total blank. From across the table, a notification pinged on my screen. It was an instant message from Ella. It just contained a single, obscure data point from a market report buried deep in our server. It was the exact piece of information I needed. I read it out and Damien just blinked, mumbled "right, okay," and moved on. She didn't draw attention to it. She just quietly saved me, then went back to her work. She was my safe harbor in that shark tank, the only person I genuinely believed had my back, no strings attached. The thing is, Sterling Cross wasn't just a workplace. It was a social ecosystem with a very clear food chain. At the top, basking in the sun, was the inner circle, and the sun in this case was Damien, our creative director. He was charismatic, sharp, and wielded his power with a casual grace that made people desperate for his approval. His circle, a handful of senior creatives and account leads, were the gatekeepers. They got the exciting, award-bait projects. They were the ones whose opinions mattered. They were, for all intents and purposes, the popular kids, and I was desperate to sit at their table. The price of admission to that circle wasn't talent or hard work, though you needed those to even stay in the game. The real currency, the thing that made them lean in and listen, was information. Specifically, gossip. The lunch table in the main breakout area was their stage. It was a daily performance of traded secrets, who was about to get poached by a rival agency, which client was secretly a nightmare, and most valuable of all, the personal dramas of our colleagues. I tried to join them a few times. I'd sit at the edge of the table, clutching my salad, trying to find an opening to say something smart about a new campaign or a market trend. But my contributions would just hang in the air for a second before being swallowed by a juicier story about someone's messy breakup. I felt invisible, juvenile. I started to believe that my work, the long hours I put in, even the successes Ella helped me achieve, were meaningless unless they were validated by a nod of approval from Damien. My anxiety was a constant, low-grade hum. I convinced myself that getting into that circle wasn't just about ego, it was about survival. It was how you built a career at a place like this. Ella saw it for what it was, of course. She called them Damien's Court of Jesters and dismissed their lunch hour theatrics as a pathetic holdover from high school. I should have listened. God, I should have listened. The moment that sealed her fate and mine was born from an evening of absolute trust. It happened about a month ago. We just wrapped up the brutal Oak Haven pitch, a project that had consumed our lives for weeks. We were the last two people in the office, sharing a greasy pizza on her desk, the city lights twinkling below us. We were giddy with exhaustion and relief. In that quiet, post-battle calm, the conversation drifted from work to life. I was talking about how much I needed a vacation, and she laughed, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. There was a flicker of something heavy behind her expression. She pushed a piece of pepperoni around the cardboard box with her finger. "Can I tell you something, Anna?" she said, her voice suddenly soft. "Something I haven't told anyone else here." I immediately land in, "Of course, anything." She took a deep breath. She told me about her fiancé, Robert. She explained that he had been released from prison on parole a few months earlier. It wasn't for anything violent, but for business fraud, a stupid, desperate mistake he'd made years ago. They were trying to piece their lives back together quietly, carefully. He was struggling to find work. They lived in constant fear of someone finding out and their fragile new beginning shattering. "We just want a clean slate," she whispered, and I could see the raw vulnerability in her eyes. It was a look I'd never seen on her before. "Anna, I'm only telling you this because I trust you completely. Please don't say a word to anyone. It would destroy him, it would destroy us." And in that moment, I meant it with every fiber of my being. "Ella, of course," I said, putting my hand on her arm. "Your secret is safe with me, I swear." That promise, that sacred trust, lasted exactly 3 weeks. It was a Thursday, lunchtime. The inner circle was holding court, and for some reason, I'd been waved over to join them. I was on the periphery, as usual, clutching a lukewarm coffee and trying to look like I belonged. The conversation was particularly vicious that day. They were tearing apart a former colleague who'd left to start his own business, which was now rumored to be failing. They picked over the details of his financial ruin with a kind of gleeful, predatory hunger. It was ugly, but I stayed, soaking in the proximity to power like a pathetic little plant turning towards a toxic sun. Then the spotlight swung to me. Damien, wiping his mouth with a napkin, turned his gaze on me. His smile was lazy, challenging. "So Anna," he said, his voice carrying across the table, silencing the others. "You're always so quiet. You and Ella are thick as thieves. She's a bit of an enigma. Surely you've got some good intel for us. What's her story?" And there it was, the moment, the test, my invitation. My entire nervous system went into overdrive. My heart started hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of panic and, shamefully, opportunity. For a split second, Ella's face flashed in my mind, her trusting eyes in the dim office light, her whispered plea, "It would destroy us." That was the voice of my conscience, a clear, desperate warning. But another voice, a louder, more seductive one, drowned it out. It was the voice of my own gnawing insecurity, the one that whispered how pathetic I was, how I'd never belong, how this was my one and only shot. I saw the expectant faces around the table, a jury of cool kids waiting for my verdict. I saw Damien's smirk, the gatekeeper holding the key. A war raged inside me for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 seconds. I could have said no. I could have laughed it off, changed the subject, said she's just a private person. I could have honored the trust of the one person in that entire building who had ever shown me a shred of genuine kindness. But I didn't. The desire to be accepted, to finally be seen by these people, was a sickness, and I let it win. I let out a small, conspiratorial laugh, a sound that felt like it was clawed from someone else's throat. "Well," I began, leaning in slightly as if I were sharing a state secret. My voice was a disgusting parody of intimacy. "You didn't hear this from me, but—" And I told them. I didn't just share the secret, I performed it. I started with a feigned reluctance, making it seem like they were pulling the story out of me. "I probably shouldn't say anything, but it's just she's been under so much stress lately." I watched them lean in, their eyes glinting. That was all the encouragement I needed. I twisted Ella's quiet pain into a juicy, dramatic narrative. I didn't just say her fiancé had been in prison for fraud. I called him a big-shot con artist who finally got caught. I painted her not as a loyal partner trying to rebuild a life, but as a naive, almost tragic figure, a woman with a dangerous taste in men. I invented details out of thin air to make the story better. I think he's basically forbidden her from talking about it, I lied, lowering my voice. She's terrified of what he might do if people found out. As I spoke, I felt a bizarre, out-of-body rush. I was feeding off their reactions, the sharp intake of breath from Cassandra, the senior copywriter. The way another guy, a strategist named Philip, shook his head in mock disbelief. I was the center of attention, I was captivating. When I finished, a beat of charged silence hung over the table. They were all looking at me, processing the story I had so callously served up. Then Philip let out a low whistle. Jesus, Anna, that's heavy. Cassandra chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. Oh, that poor thing, I always knew there was something sad about her. But the only reaction that mattered was Damien's. He leaned back in his chair, studying me for a long moment. He slowly nodded, a flicker of what I interpreted as respect or at least amusement in his eyes. Huh, he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. Didn't see that one coming. Good stuff, Anna. For a split second, I felt a sickening jolt of triumph. My shaky hand reached for my coffee and the taste was bitter like ash. I had done it, I was in. I had paid the price, I just didn't realize yet that the price was everything. The fallout wasn't a dramatic explosion, it was a slow, creeping frost. The next day, Friday, the office felt different, or maybe I was the one who was different. I felt a low thrum of guilt under my skin, but I tried to push it down, telling myself it was just a bit of harmless gossip, the kind of thing that happened every day. I said good morning to Ella as she passed my desk. She didn't respond, she didn't even look at me. She just walked to her computer, sat down, and put on her headphones. A cold knot of dread began to form in my stomach. I sent her a message on our work chat, hey, coffee later. The little three dots that show someone is typing appeared, then vanished. Appeared again, then vanished. This happened 3 or 4 times. Finally, a message popped up. It wasn't from her, it was the system-generated notification. This user has not read your message. She hadn't just ignored me, she had actively marked it as unread, a small digital act of erasure. The knot in my stomach tightened. Later that afternoon, I cornered her by the water cooler. Ella, hey, I said, trying to sound casual. Is everything okay? You seem a little off today. She turned from the machine, her water bottle in her hand. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw her eyes. There was no anger, no tears, just a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. It was the look of someone whose worst fears had been confirmed. I heard Anna, she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. It was scarier than if she had been screaming. I heard what you said at lunch yesterday, Cassandra told me. She thought I should know who my real friends are. The blood drained from my face. I opened my mouth to spew out a torrent of excuses, that it wasn't how it sounded, that I was just trying to fit in, that I was sorry. But the words caught in my throat, choked by the sheer, pathetic inadequacy of any possible defense. She just looked at me, waiting, and in my silence, she found her answer. I have only one question, she said, her voice still unnervingly calm. Was it you? I couldn't speak, I could only give a tiny, miserable nod. She held my gaze for another second, then gave a single, sharp nod of her own, as if confirming a final data point in a long, painful equation. I understand, she said. And then she walked away. That was it. That was the last real conversation we ever had. From that moment on, she initiated what I can only describe as a complete and total programmatic severance of our friendship. All work communication was rerouted through formal channels, emails only, with our project manager always copied. If we ended up in the same elevator, she would stare at the numbers above the door. If our paths crossed in the hallway, her eyes would slide right past me as if I were a piece of furniture. It was a quiet, methodical, and utterly brutal amputation. No drama, no confrontation, just a clean, cold cut. That weekend was agony. I kept replaying that conversation, her chillingly calm, I understand, over and over in my head. I convinced myself that this was just her way of processing, that after a few days of cooling off, she'd see it was a stupid mistake and we could talk it through. I was a fool. When I walked in on Monday and saw her empty desk, the reality of what I had done finally crashed down on me. Ella wasn't just giving me the silent treatment. She had taken decisive, permanent action. She had removed herself from the equation entirely. I thought naively that at least I had what I wanted. I had bought my seat at the cool kids' table, but the seat felt wobbly and the table was colder than I could have imagined. Damien and his circle were civil to me, but in a new, distant way. The knowing smirks and conspiratorial glances I had mistaken for acceptance were gone. Now, when I approached them, conversations would subtly halt. I was no longer the teller of a juicy secret, I was the secret itself. I was the person who couldn't be trusted. Damien started assigning me to less significant projects, citing vague reasons like managing bandwidth. When the brief for the prestigious AeroCorp campaign came in, the kind of project Ella and I would have killed for, he assigned it to Philip and Cassandra without even discussing it with me. When I tried to ask him about it, he gave me a noncommittal smile and said, "We need a team with proven synergy on this one." The subtext was deafening. The real blow, the one that shattered my last remaining delusion, came from the most unexpected source. Priya, a kind, no-nonsense woman from HR, stopped me in the kitchen a few days later. She was refilling her water bottle, and I was just standing there staring into my mug like it held the answers to the universe. "Anna," she said quietly, her eyes full of a sympathy I didn't deserve. "I'm sorry about Ella, it was a loss for the team." "Yeah," I mumbled, "it was a shock. This Manchester opportunity came out of nowhere." Priya looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she sighed, a soft, weary sound. It was the third-party echo I had been dreading. "It wasn't a great opportunity, Anna," she said, her voice dropping even lower. "The pay is less and the projects are smaller. I processed the transfer request myself." She took a demotion to get away from this office. My head snapped up. "What? Why?" Priya hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. She didn't name names. She's too professional for that. She just said in her formal request that she could no longer work in an environment where she felt fundamentally unsafe. And that the source of that feeling came from the one person she trusted the most. The words hit me with the force of a physical impact. Unsafe, that was the word she used. I hadn't just embarrassed her. I hadn't just betrayed a secret. I had made her feel unsafe in her own workplace, a place where she had once been my protector. I realized then that my little act of social climbing hadn't just pushed a friend away. It had broadcast to the entire office, especially to the people I was so desperate to impress, exactly what I was capable of. They didn't see me as an ally now, they saw me as a liability, a backstabber, someone who would sell out their closest friend for a moment in the spotlight. My desperate attempt to join the circle had only resulted in my total systemic isolation. Now I just sit here at my desk, staring at the empty one across the aisle. It's a void. A constant, silent monument to my stupidity. I got what I wanted, didn't I? I made a splash at the lunch table. I got that nod from Damien. And in exchange, I atomized the only authentic relationship I had in this entire city. My career here is over, I know it is. I'm not on the inside track anymore. I'm not even on the track, I'm a ghost, haunting the hallways of a place where I used to have a future. The worst part is the silence. The crushing, deafening silence where Ella's quiet presence used to be. I've messed up, I know that. I've replayed it 1,000 times, trying to pinpoint the exact moment I turned into this person, this desperate, pathetic creature. But it's all a blur of anxiety and bad decisions. How did it get to this point? How do you stop this free fall feeling once it starts?